The snow was still falling when the ambulance pulled up to the intersection of East McNichols and Brush. It was just before sunrise, and Detroit was still asleep under a blanket of fog. But in the middle of the street, where the gray snow turned red, a body lay motionless. It was a scene as quiet as it was horrifying. The woman had been shot in the chest at close range, her life ending within seconds. What shocked investigators, however, was not just the brutality of the crime, it was the identity of the man who pulled the trigger. Hours after the shooting, he calmly walked into work, clocked in, and only then called police to report what he described as an incident. That man was not a gangster, not a drifter, not even a stranger to the victim. He was Pastor Albert Weathers, a preacher, a husband, and a man whose secret life had finally collided with his public one. And the victim? Kelly Stowe, better known to her friends as Keena Matt, a beloved figure in Detroit's ballroom community, whose death would shake an entire city to its core. On the bitterly cold morning of the 7th of December, 2018, Detroit was still wrapped in fog when a gunshot echoed through its deserted streets. It was a single shot, sharp, close, and deliberate. A car door slammed shut, tires screeched against the icy pavement, and within seconds, silence returned, leaving only one person bleeding on the ground. That person was Kelly Stowe. 20-something, full of life. Kelly was known in her community as a performer, a fashion enthusiast, and a friend who could light up any room with her wit. But in those early hours, none of that mattered. The cold street became her final stage. The first responders who rushed to the scene found her slumped near the curb. Her pulse was weak, her breath shallow. Snowflakes clung to her hair as if nature itself was trying to shield her from the cruelty of that night. But by the time the ambulance doors closed, it was too late. Kelly's story had ended in violence. At first, police knew little. A witness described a car stopping briefly at the intersection, a door opening, then shutting quickly before speeding away. No one saw the shooter clearly. No weapon was left behind. Just fragments of an encounter that ended in death. But what made the case truly chilling was what investigators learned just an hour later. A man had called police from his workplace, reporting that he had been involved in a shooting. His name, Albert Weathers. His occupation, pastor. Weathers had driven away from the scene, gone to his job at the Great Lakes Water Authority, clocked in on time, and only then picked up the phone. To investigators, this wasn't just odd, it was deeply suspicious. If the shooting had been an accident or self-defense, why not call immediately? Why let Kelly lie in the street, dying, while he carried on as if nothing had happened? When detectives questioned him, Weathers claimed Kelly had threatened him. He said he panicked, pulled his gun, and it went off. It was a story that painted him as a victim, a man forced to defend himself. But almost instantly, cracks began to show. For one, there was no evidence Kelly had been armed. No weapon was found on her, no gunshot residue on her hands. Witness accounts didn't mention any struggle, only a brief stop and then the car pulling away. And then there was the shot itself. Forensic experts later determined it had been fired at extremely close range, the trajectory too precise to be accidental. But what truly unraveled Weathers' claim was not just science, it was his double life. While Weathers was known publicly as a pastor, a husband, and a man of God, the transgender community in Detroit knew him differently. In Palmer Park, an area long recognized as a gathering place for transgender women, Weathers was a familiar face. Not as a preacher, not as a savior, but as a client. Multiple women came forward, saying they had seen him late at night. Not once, but many times. Kelly herself was among them. She wasn't a stranger to him, and their encounter on that December night was far from random. The picture became clearer. A respected pastor, living a double life, fearing exposure. And a woman who embodied everything he was drawn to, but could never admit publicly. As investigators dug deeper, the contradictions only multiplied. Weathers first insisted the gun discharged by mistake. Later, he said Kelly tried to rob him. Then, he shifted again, claiming fear for his life. Each version contradicted the last, and with each shift, his credibility weakened. For Kelly's friends, none of it was surprising. They knew the risks transgender women faced, especially in cities like Detroit. Violence wasn't uncommon, and neither were men who lived in the shadows, drawn to them in secret but terrified of being discovered. Kelly had often spoken of wanting a better world, one where women like her could live without fear. She loved fashion, loved performance, but more than anything, she loved people. She was the kind of person who lifted others up, who offered comfort when someone was lost. Her death wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was a loss for an entire community. But the haunting question remained. Why did Albert Weathers, a man who preached love, forgiveness, and truth, choose violence instead? Was it fear of being exposed? A panic in the moment? Or was it something darker, a deliberate act to silence the very person who held his secret? As news of the shooting spread, the community's grief turned into outrage. A pastor accused of killing a transgender woman was not just a headline. It was a symbol of deeper contradictions in society, where religion and morality clashed with hidden desires, and where marginalized lives could be erased in silence. Kelly could no longer speak for herself. The only story left was Weathers' version, fragmented and shifting. But evidence, witnesses, and the quiet truth beneath his polished image suggested something far more sinister. The trial would drag on for years, slowed by legal hurdles, delays, and denials. Yet from the very beginning, the question hung in the air, like the morning fog over Detroit's streets. Was this truly self-defense, or the desperate act of a man terrified of his own truth being revealed? Before she became the headline of a tragic story, before her name was carried on news reports and police documents, Kelly Stowe was simply known as Keena to her friends. To the Detroit ballroom community, she wasn't just another performer on the stage. She was the kind of presence that filled the room before she even stepped under the lights. From the time she was a teenager, Kelly gravitated toward fashion and performance. While others in her neighborhood wrestled with the daily struggles of survival in a city weighed down by economic collapse, Kelly was stitching together outfits, piecing together dreams, and strutting across makeshift runways that transformed abandoned halls into magical worlds. She wasn't just walking, she was declaring her existence. Each pose, each turn, each glittering smile was a way of saying, I am here. I matter. In the ballroom, she found not just a stage, but a family. Detroit's ballroom houses weren't just about competition, they were sanctuaries for those rejected by the outside world. For transgender women like Kelly, who faced rejection, discrimination, and constant danger, the ballroom was a place where she could shine without apology. And in the House of Ebony, one of the most respected houses in Detroit, Kelly became not just a star but a mentor, someone younger members looked up to. "She always had time for you," one of her friends later said. "If you were struggling, if you felt like nobody cared, Kelly would make you laugh. She'd tell you you were beautiful. She'd remind you that you had a place. But outside the bright lights of the ballroom, the world was cruel." Transgender women in Detroit often had few safe options to survive. Many were pushed into dangerous situations, where secrecy and stigma turned ordinary encounters into risks. And it was in those blurred spaces, where survival collided with vulnerability, that Kelly crossed paths with Albert Weathers. On Sundays, Albert Weathers stood at the pulpit, his voice rising with scripture, guiding his congregation in prayers of forgiveness and salvation. He was 46, married, employed at the Great Lakes Water Authority, and in the eyes of many, a model citizen. To his church, he was Pastor Weathers, a man entrusted with teaching the Word of God. But late at night, away from the pulpit, he moved in different circles. In Palmer Park, well known as a meeting place for transgender women, he was a familiar figure. Not as a preacher, not as a protector, but as a client. Witnesses would later testify that they had seen him there many times. Some knew him by sight, others by name. And Kelly, too, had seen him. She knew him, maybe better than anyone suspected. This dual life, the preacher by day, the secret visitor by night, was more than just hypocrisy. It was a ticking time bomb. For men like Weathers, the terror of exposure was always lurking. What would happen if the church found out? If his wife discovered the truth? If the image of respectability he carefully built was shattered by whispers of his late-night encounters? In December 2018, those fears and that double life collided. The tragedy didn't unfold in the heat of some random scuffle between strangers. No, Kelly and Albert weren't strangers at all. And that was what made the crime so haunting. When Weathers later claimed he fired in self-defense, that Kelly threatened him, investigators struggled to reconcile his story with the evidence. There were no signs she attacked him, no weapon, no struggle, only a single, close-range bullet. For Kelly's friends, the implication was clear. She hadn't been killed because she was violent. She had been killed because she represented a truth Weathers couldn't allow to surface. And so, in the early hours of the 7th of December, while fog wrapped the city and the snow muted every sound, a pastor made his choice. He pulled the trigger. He left Kelly in the street. He drove away to work, as if trying to fold himself back into the life of an ordinary man. But no matter how many times he tried to retell the story, accident, self-defense, panic, there was one detail he couldn't rewrite. Kelly could no longer speak for herself. Her community, her family, her friends, they became her voice. And they asked the question no one could ignore. How could a man of God, a shepherd of souls, justify leaving a young woman to die in the cold? The cold morning of the 7th of December, 2018, left police with more questions than answers. Kelly's body had been found with a single gunshot wound to the chest. There were no signs of a struggle on the street, no scattered belongings that suggested a fight, no footprints that told the story of a chase. Everything pointed not to chaos, but to a swift, deliberate act. Still, Albert Weathers clung to his story. He told officers he had been threatened. He said he felt in danger, that the gun had discharged in a moment of panic. To some, the words sounded almost rehearsed, the kind of explanation a man offers not in shock, but in strategy. But detectives knew something was off the moment they pieced together his timeline. Instead of dialing 911 immediately after firing the shot, Weathers drove away. He clocked in for work. Only then, safe inside the walls of his job, did he make the call. It was a detail investigators could not ignore. If fear had truly driven him to pull the trigger, why hadn't he been just as fearful for Kelly's life? Why was his first instinct to protect himself, rather than to save another? Witnesses slowly began to fill the gaps. Someone recalled seeing a car stop near the intersection. The door opened, just for a few seconds. Then, the car sped off into the fog. That fleeting image, combined with Weathers' admission, began to weave a chilling narrative. The pastor hadn't simply been caught in a moment of panic. He had made choices, calculated ones. The autopsy only deepened the suspicions. The bullet had entered at close range, its trajectory clean and direct. This was not the erratic shot of a man waving a gun in desperation. It was precise, controlled. Forensic analysts concluded that the gun had been fired intentionally, not accidentally. And then came the most damning detail. There was no gunpowder residue on Kelly's hands. She hadn't fired a weapon. She hadn't even touched one, which meant Weathers' story of being attacked, of being forced to defend himself, was unraveling. Investigators began to dig into his life outside the pulpit, and what they uncovered painted a portrait far removed from the image of a holy man. In Palmer Park, a well-known gathering spot for transgender women, Weathers' face was familiar. He was not a preacher walking among them to offer prayers or guidance. He was a regular customer. Women testified to seeing him there often, arriving in the late hours, blending into a world he publicly condemned but privately pursued. One witness, a transgender woman who had known Kelly for years, testified that Kelly and Weathers had interacted before. This wasn't a chance encounter. They knew each other. Their paths had crossed more than once. And in that familiarity lay motive, because familiarity meant risk. Kelly knew too much. As detectives built their case, Weathers' story kept shifting. At first, he claimed self-defense. Later, he said the gun discharged by accident. Each version contradicted the last, leaving prosecutors to argue that inconsistency itself was a form of guilt. Truth does not change. Lies evolve. Meanwhile, Kelly's community mourned loudly and publicly. Vigils lit up the cold streets of Detroit, candles flickering against the winter wind. Friends spoke of her dreams to design clothes, to build a safe space for women like her. To be remembered not just as a victim, but as a sister, a friend, a voice that mattered. The grief was sharp, but beneath it was something else. Determination. They would not let her story fade into silence. The investigation stretched on, and with it, the pressure on Albert Weathers mounted. Prosecutors pressed him with contradictions. If it was self-defense, why leave the scene? If it was panic, why clock in at work before calling? If it was an accident, why was the bullet fired so cleanly, so deliberately? Each question chipped away at the wall he had built around himself. Still, Weathers resisted. He leaned on his role as a pastor, as a husband, as a man of faith. He insisted he had not meant to kill. Yet, the evidence kept pointing toward something darker. By the time the case reached the courtroom, the public had already chosen sides. To some, he was a hypocrite, a man living a double life who murdered to protect it. To others, he was a flawed man who panicked in the wrong moment. But in the eyes of Kelly's community, there was only one truth. A pastor had taken the life of a young transgender woman who deserved to live, And nothing, not a title, not a sermon, not a desperate story could excuse it. The trial would not move quickly. Delays, hearings, legal maneuvers all stretched the case over years. Each postponement reopened the wound for Kelly's family. Each delay became another reminder of the imbalance of power. A pastor with resources and influence, and a young woman whose voice had been stolen. But one detail kept haunting the investigators, one question that lingered no matter how many facts were uncovered. Was Kelly killed simply because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or was she silenced because she knew too much about the secret life of a pastor who could not afford to be exposed? The trial of Albert Weathers was never going to be a simple matter of evidence and testimony. It was also about image, reputation, and the uncomfortable collision of faith, identity, and truth. On one side stood the prosecution, determined to prove that Weathers had killed Kelly Stowe, not out of self-defense, but out of fear of exposure, fear of scandal, fear of living openly with the double life he had created. On the other side stood the defense, clinging to the image of a pastor, a husband, a man who simply made a terrible mistake. When court convened, the first thing jurors saw was Weathers himself. He walked in wearing a suit, quiet and reserved, his Bible never far from reach. To the unknowing eye, he looked like any other preacher, a man more likely to deliver sermons about forgiveness than to stand accused of murder. But prosecutors wasted no time in reminding the jury that appearances are not truth. They opened with the 911 call. Weathers' voice filled the courtroom, calm but strangely detached, telling the operator that he had shot someone. Not a woman, not Kelly, just someone. To Kelly's mother, sitting in the gallery with her hands clasped tightly, those words were salt in an open wound. The casual anonymity reduced her daughter to nothing, a nameless body in the street. Then came the timeline. The prosecution laid it out with ruthless precision. Weathers shot Kelly. He left her bleeding in the cold. He drove away. He clocked in at work. Only then did he decide to call for help. The jury listened, as detectives explained how unusual that sequence was. A panicked man calls immediately. A guilty man drives away. The prosecution let the silence linger, allowing the jurors to connect the dots themselves. Next came the autopsy results. A forensic expert described how the bullet entered Kelly's chest at close range, straight and steady. Not the wild shot of a man flailing in terror, but the calculated squeeze of a trigger. This was intentional, the expert said. The evidence does not support an accident. The defense countered with a softer story. They painted Weathers as a man trapped in a dangerous situation. They argued that the neighborhood where the shooting occurred was known for crime, that Kelly had threatened him, that he had no choice but to protect himself. They urged jurors to see him not as a hypocrite, but as a human being who made a tragic, split-second decision. But witnesses from Kelly's community tore through that narrative. One by one, they came forward to speak of Palmer Park, of the nights Weathers was seen there, of the whispered encounters that betrayed his secret life. Some recalled conversations Kelly had about him. Others said flatly, he knew her. They weren't strangers. Each testimony chipped away at the pastor's image. Each detail painted the picture of a man with more to lose than anyone realized. And for the jurors, the contradiction was impossible to ignore. Could a man of God truly walk such a double path? And if so, what wouldn't he do to keep it hidden? Through it all, Kelly's mother sat quietly in the courtroom. Her grief was a steady presence, her silence louder than any testimony. She had lost her daughter, No verdict could bring Kelly back, but she wanted the world to hear the truth, not just about how Kelly died, but about how she lived, loved, and deserved better than the cold pavement of a Detroit street. The trial stretched on. The defense repeated its arguments, clinging to words like fear, panic, mistake. The prosecution sharpened its blade, using forensics, witnesses, and Weathers' own shifting stories to build a case of deliberate action. And then, after days of testimony, after weeks of grief and tension, the moment arrived. The jury was dismissed to deliberate. The courtroom emptied into a charged silence. On one side, Kelly's family clutched each other's hands, whispering prayers into the quiet. On the other, Weathers sat with his attorneys, head bowed, Bible open, lips moving silently as though Scripture alone could protect him from the truth waiting just beyond the deliberation room doors. Would the jury see him as a frightened man who panicked? Or would they see him for what Kelly's community believed he was? A killer who pulled the trigger to bury a secret. The jury deliberated for hours. Behind closed doors, 12 strangers sifted through the fragments of a life stolen and a reputation shattered. They weighed the autopsy reports, the 911 call, the testimonies of witnesses, and the contradictions in Albert Weathers' story. Each piece of evidence whispered the same truth. Kelly Stowe had not died by accident. When the jury finally filed back into the courtroom, the air was thick with silence. Every seat was filled. Activists, reporters, family members, churchgoers. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone present. Albert Weathers stood, his hands clasped, his Bible still in reach. His lips moved quietly, repeating prayers no one else could hear. Across the aisle, Kelly's mother sat rigid, her eyes fixed on the jurors, bracing herself for the words that would either break her again or finally give her daughter justice. The foreperson rose. A sheet of paper trembled in their hands. And then, the words fell like a stone into the room. We, the jury, find the defendant guilty. The silence shattered. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Kelly's mother covered her face with both hands, tears streaming as family and friends clutched her shoulders. Activists from Detroit's ballroom community wept openly, holding each other as if to keep from collapsing. After years of grief, delays, and doubt, there was finally a measure of justice. Weathers' face, however, barely moved. Some said he looked stunned, others said resigned. But beneath the calm exterior, one thing was undeniable. The double life he had fought so desperately to hide had been dragged into the light, exposed for the world to see. The sentencing came weeks later. Prosecutors demanded accountability, reminding the court of the brutality of the act, shooting a young woman in cold blood, leaving her to die in the street, then walking into work as if nothing had happened. They described Kelly not as a nameless figure, but as a daughter, a friend, a star in her community whose light had been extinguished far too soon. When it was her turn to speak, Kelly's mother rose. Her voice was steady, though her hands shook. She told the court who Kelly really was, the laughter, the style, the heart that drew people in. She spoke of her daughter's dreams, of her courage, of the emptiness left behind. And then she turned toward Weathers. "You left my child in the cold," she said. "You didn't see her as human. But she was. And today, the world knows her name." The judge delivered the sentence with gravity. Albert Weathers would serve time in prison for the killing of Kelly Stowe. A man who once preached forgiveness would now live out his days seeking it from behind bars. But for Kelly's community, The verdict meant more than just years added to a sentence. It was a message. For too long, the deaths of transgender women, especially women of color, had gone unnoticed, their cases buried, their names forgotten. Kelly's story, and the conviction that followed, carved her name into history. Outside the courthouse, candles flickered once more, this time not just in mourning, but in defiance. Friends and activists gathered with photos of Kelly, chanting her name, lifting their voices against a world that had so often silenced them. She didn't die in vain, one activist declared. Her story will protect the next girl. Her name will remind this city that our lives matter. Yet beneath the victory of justice, there lingered an ache no verdict could heal. Kelly was gone. No sentence, no guilty verdict. No courtroom could bring her back. Her absence would forever echo in the ballroom, in the family gatherings, in the lives of those she touched. Still, there was power in what had been achieved. A pastor had been unmasked. A system had listened. A community had refused to let Kelly's life be reduced to a statistic. And in that defiance, Kelly's voice lived on. Kelly Stowe's murder was not an isolated act of violence. It was part of a grim pattern that has haunted America for years. A pattern where transgender women, especially Black transgender women, face disproportionate levels of violence, discrimination, and erasure. In 2018 alone, at least 26 transgender people were reported murdered in the United States. Advocates say the real number is even higher, hidden behind police misreporting and families unwilling to acknowledge their loved one's truth. Too often, victims are misgendered in death, their stories buried under layers of stigma. Kelly's case stood out because it broke through that silence. Her name made headlines, her face appeared on news screens, and her killer was held accountable in a court of law. But for every Kelly Stowe whose story reaches the public, there are countless others whose names are never spoken, whose deaths are never investigated with the same determination. What happened in Detroit was a collision of forces: religion, secrecy, identity, and fear. It exposed the hypocrisy of a man who preached righteousness by day and prowled Palmer Park by night. It revealed how fragile the lives of transgender women can be when they are forced into the shadows of society. And it reminded the world that behind every statistic is a human being with dreams, friends, and a voice worth remembering. Kelly was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a friend, a performer who lit up the ballroom stage, a young woman who dreamed of designing clothes, of creating a safer world for people like her. Her life was full of light, and though it was stolen too soon, that light continues to shine in the voices of those who speak her name. Her mother still fights for justice, not just for Kelly, but for every transgender woman left vulnerable to hate and silence. Detroit's LGBTQ+ community continues to honor her at vigils, on stage, and in the very ballroom where she once ruled as Kina. Each strut, each turn, each beat of music becomes an act of remembrance, and the courtroom where Albert Weathers was convicted stands as a symbol, however imperfect, that the lives of transgender women are not disposable, that their stories matter, that their killers can and must be held accountable. But perhaps the most haunting part of Kelly's story is not the night she died, it is the question she leaves behind for all of us. How many more names will be lost before society finally listens? For Kelly Stowe, the answer came too late. But her story continues to echo, warning us, urging us, demanding that her death not be in vain. As long as her name is spoken, Kelly lives on.